Hi, everyone. It's Ed Lee, the founder of NewNFT.com, NOUNFT.com. In today's episode, we will be engaging in some myth busting, starting with perhaps the biggest myth about NFTs. And that is that buying an NFT is actually buying the artwork or content associated with an NFT. And that is typically not the case. When you buy an NFT, you don't get to own the art that is associated with an NFT. You certainly don't get the IP rights to the art or content. And sometimes, and perhaps often, you don't even get to own a personal copy of the art or content associated with the NFT. That will be all determined by a content license that the NFT producer or the marketplace where the NFT is being sold determines what uses the buyer can make with underlying or associated art that is identified with a particular NFT. Now, you may be scratching your head and thinking, well, if I buy an NFT and pay a lot of money for it, what do I actually own? And I think that is the $64,000 or Bitcoin question, or Ethereum is probably the better description for it, since most NFTs now are being sold on Ethereum. Now, to answer that question, I will use an old example from the analog world, which if you watch my prior videos, you probably know that I like using analogies to things that people can easily relate to based on the analog world. And this example will date me somewhat because card catalogs typically do not exist anymore. But back in the day, libraries used to have elaborate classification systems that they still use today, but based or recorded in note cards that were stored in catalogs that looked sort of like this. And on a note card, a book's information, the title, the author, and also the year of publication, and then finally a number that was based on what was called or what is called the Dewey Decimal System, an elaborate classification system. That number was contained on the card so that the person in the library interested in that book could go find, based on that number, where the book is located in the stacks of the library. Now, let's imagine one day the library decided, because everything is digital today with their card catalog system, that they're going to sell these paper cards to the public. And let's just say a buyer had an interest in buying the card for one of the books. Hopefully with this example, you can intuitively conclude that buying the card, the paper card, would not necessarily give the buyer the book rights to the book itself that is referred to in the card. If the library simply said, we are selling the paper note cards, I think most people would not automatically jump to the conclusion that they somehow have rights to the book, the physical book on the bookshelves of the library. You might ask about it, but I don't think people would jump to the conclusion, yes, I necessarily get the book because I bought this piece of paper, this free 3x5 piece of paper. Okay, now let's turn to what happens in the sale of an NFT. This is somewhat similar to the example that I just used, although it's in the digital context. An NFT is a token in the form of computer code. It has some basic identification information that makes it unique. It also will keep track of ownership and transactions related to that token. All of it's being stored on blockchain. Okay, so it could have been cryptocurrency stored on blockchain, but cryptocurrency is so-called fungible. One Bitcoin can be exchanged for another Bitcoin, whereas an NFT is non-fungible. It is unique because it has a specific identifier as being unique. And that's what separates it from cryptocurrency. But back to our comparison with the card catalog example. Creators of NFTs are including additional information as a part of the NFT that is associating it with something else that exists in the world. And typically it's art or some other content. It's referring to something else, kind of like the note card referred to a book that was stored on the shelves. Here in my example, let's say I have created an NFT and it refers to a digital work that I have created called Blondie. And this is stored on some server somewhere, or we can use a peer-to-peer storage system. IPFS is becoming popular, for instance, but it is not stored on blockchain. It is completely separate from blockchain. And that's an important distinction. Just as the books, physical books, are stored on shelves and not stored in the card catalog, my art, Blondie, is stored on some server somewhere, and it's not stored on blockchain with the NFT. Now, the NFT contains information referring to my work, but it doesn't contain the file of my work, and that file is completely separate from blockchain and the NFT. So hopefully you begin to see how this plays out if I sell my NFT. There's a buyer that comes along and pays hopefully a lot of Ethereum for this NFT. And as a part of the purchase of the NFT, just the token, the buyer is not buying the underlying or associated art, Blondie. And all of the uses that the buyer can make of Blondie, the associated artwork, will be determined by the terms of the license that I have created, or I could have adopted from a standard license offered by a marketplace as a part of the purchase of the NFT. And the NFT producer can decide whether, for instance, the buyer gets a personal copy to use or potentially to own, whether the buyer can make any commercial uses of the underlying artwork or not, whether the buyer can use the image of the artwork on other platforms. All of that will be spelled out, or should be spelled out, in the content license that is a part of the sale of the NFT. But notice again the difference between the art and the NFT, just as the difference between the book and a card in the card catalog referring to the book. Okay, so in today's episode, we have busted the myth that buying an NFT is somehow buying the art or content associated with NFT. When you buy an NFT, you typically don't get to own the art. A license, a content license, will determine the uses a buyer can make with respect to the associated art or content related or identified by an NFT. So obviously, it's really important for buyers to review the terms of the license so they fully understand before they shell out a lot of Ethereum that here are the uses that I am permitted under this content license. Okay, now in a future episode, we will be covering a second myth related to the difference between content licenses and so-called smart contracts. So stay tuned for that. Please do check us out on nounft.com, nounft.com, and subscribe to the YouTube.